Hey everyone, this is Scott from SertMedia.com, and in this video we're covering Social Warfare Pro, a paid add-on for the free Social Warfare plugin. Social Warfare Pro essentially builds on top of the foundation of Social Warfare just by adding additional share buttons, a lot of them as you can see, and some additional unique functionality that we're going to get into. For those of you who may be wondering, while I personally do not use Social Warfare, I'm currently using NovaShare. I still highly recommend Social Warfare because it is a well-made plugin and it's very quick. It's fast loading. It's not as fast as NovaShare, but it's still a really strong contender with quite a bit of sharing functionality. So Social Warfare Pro, as in the free version, you select your buttons here. You could choose which buttons you wish to show. You can change their order just by dragging and dropping, and you can add a variety of social networks that are not included by default. One interesting bit is if you choose to use the WhatsApp and Viber options, they will only load on mobile devices. That way your desktop users aren't getting a bunch of odd sub options that they're probably never going to use. Then you have the button ordering. You can either choose to sort dynamically by the order of most shares. Basically, Social Warfare will check the share count. It'll see which of your social networks are the most used, and it'll order them in that fashion. Alternatively, the drag and drop method, as I just showed you, is what you can use. Personally, I'll just use the manual mode. Emphasize buttons allows you to emphasize the share buttons by enlarging the first two. I'll show you what this looks like. So I'm going to set it to only emphasize the first button, of which we're going to see, Facebook, and then the rest are not emphasized, which is a bit of an interesting bit of functionality. The more button allows you to get a nice pop-up that opens up all your share buttons. So if you want to have all available options, but you don't want to load them all on the home page because it'd be quite lengthy, the more button can be included. Under the share counters, while I'm personally not a fan of share counters, there is a couple of options you can do. You can obviously just enable them like you would expect. You can modify a minimum number of shares. When this option is enabled, the share counter will not be shown until it crosses a barrier of X amount of shares. So as you can see over here, it's down to 10 shares. Let's say I set it to 100. Reload the page, and the share counter does not show. And as always, you can either choose to show the total count on or off, which is that total number of shares that was on the right-hand side. You could choose to show decimal places. You shouldn't really need to do this. And then the alignment, you can set the alignment of the share counter to be on the left or the right. Personally, I think the right-hand side makes the most sense. If you're using a social media plugin or an SEO plugin, whether that is Yoast SEO, all-in-one, Rank Math, you can come in here and disable the social meta tags and leave it up to those plugins. I would highly recommend you do that. If you have duplicate Open Graph tags displaying, what can happen is the social network that you're sharing to can either choose the incorrect image or it may just pull one randomly. Typically what they do now is they just pick whichever tags appear first in the HTML. But that's something to keep in mind. I just turn them off because it's never good to have duplicate Open Graph tags, and it's even documented as being an error if you use the debugging tools. The position share buttons allows you to quickly just turn on or off where you want your share buttons to load. You could choose to enable the floating buttons. The floating buttons have to be enabled in two locations, which we'll jump into, but you could choose to show it either above, below, above and below, or a manual placement option. And then of course, if you want your floating buttons to be enabled, you first have to do it here. And this is the pages that it'll show on. But when we get to the floating section, I'll show you how it actually works because I currently have it disabled. The image hover pin button essentially loads the default Pinterest script that takes it, the pin it script. Basically, you have a post, you hover over it, the Pinterest save button, it'll open up a little Pinterest box. You go ahead and you pin the image to your board. This is very popular on blogging websites. This wasn't a functionality that I covered in the NovaShare video because it didn't exist yet, but it does now exist in there. Most well-built share buttons have this functionality. Social Warfare's had it forever, and it works great. I've never had any problems with sites that use it. The Yumly display control. So with Yumly, you could choose to only show it on specific categories or tags. Yumly is particularly meant for recipes to be shared. So if you're a website that covers multiple niches and topics, you may want to set your category to be recipe if that's how you're categorizing your post. So that way the Yumly option doesn't show on all posts, which it would be irrelevant on. You could choose to promote social warfare with a affiliate link. I wouldn't do that personally, even though I'm probably going to have one in the bottom of this video. You just don't want to spam your website with an affiliate link, especially if you don't cover WordPress plugins. It's kind of a weird thing to do. I don't get why a lot of plugins do this. They do it for self-promotion, obviously, but it's quite silly. Under the style section, now this is where you can get a good idea of how buttons will look on your website. So as you can see here, it shows you essentially what your buttons are going to look like. Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, LinkedIn. This is just an example. Obviously, it's not the social networks I have selected over here. And you can do a couple of options. What's great about the Pro version is you get so many customization options, which is great if you're not a developer. And that's very important. A good plugin should have a means for somebody who's not a developer to modify the appearance on a basic level. So you get flat and fresh. This is the option that you get in the free version. Everything afterwards is locked behind the Pro version. You get a leaf on the wind, which just kind of gives it a bit of a curve so they look like leaves. Looks kind of fine, I guess. Shift makes them slanted. Some designs, typically around like car style, car themes, they tend to have slanted designs. Pills, which I'm not a fan of personally. 3D, which, yeah, we're just gonna just leave it, yeah. Connected is just rammed together, kind of weird. Modern is large with a lot of spacing. Really, I think the first one looks more modern. And dark mode, which is the modern, but in dark. We'll just go ahead and stick with modern though, I guess, just so that way we get the various outlines. You could choose your default color set. So you could choose full color, which is it'll use the brand colors, light gray, dark gray. The rest, you could even choose a custom color, and you can define the custom color with the hex code, and this will apply to all the buttons. Personally, I would probably just go with like a dark gray as the default color set, so that way you get that nice minimalist looking design. Your button size, you could choose kind of a weird setting. So it defaults at 100%, which looks normal. You can go up to 40%, and you can go all the way down to 70%. It's not so much the button that changes, but the text in the button. So if you're trying to make your buttons look a little bit less full, you could decrease the size. For most websites, probably stick somewhere around the 90, maybe even the 80 to like 110 range. 110 is if you're really going for a big, bold design and you're trying to accompany larger screen sizes. For the floating share buttons now we can turn those back on. You get two options. You get more than two options, but you get a lot of floating positions. You can choose to be on the left-hand side of the post, or rather the page, the right-hand side of the page, which they'll just be over to the left and right. I'll show you what this looks like. Looks over here. It does take the styling of your other buttons, so it does feel like it fits naturally. And when you get to a certain point, they will fade out. They look great. On the right-hand side, it obviously goes to the right-hand side. Personally, I don't recommend sticking them on the right-hand side, primarily because they'll never be seen. Users tend to read in an F-shaped pattern, so they'll notice more what's on their left-hand side of the screen. Then you could choose to do it at the top of the page, which looks fine. It's really just a sticky share button. You could do it at the bottom of the page, which is where it'll stick towards the bottom. Personally, I'm not that big of a fan of these trends because I find them to be very obnoxious. You could choose to keep it at the top or bottom or turn it off completely for mobile devices. I would probably recommend turning it off on mobile devices solely because they don't have much screen real estate to share in the first place. Then you get the click to tweet functionality. Basically, very straightforward. You get an embeddable block that you can put in your post. We'll go ahead and show that right here. And you could choose a variety of themes that we'll just cover real quick. So The click to tweet, you have a couple of styles. If you're on the default, you get the, I believe it's technically something like Freebird. When you choose your visual theme, you really just modify the style globally. This is a global option. Don't Stop Believin', Thunderstruck, Living on a Prayer. Love that name. We're going with that. I don't know how they chose their names, but they're kind of fun. So what you do is you go to your post, and this is primarily meant for the Gutenberg editor. It will work in the older style editor, but come on, it's 2020. Let's use Gutenberg. All right, so you click Add Your Block, and you can either scroll down and find the social warfare box, and you can use the social warfare buttons, which will just embed the share buttons, the Pinterest image, which we're not going to do, or the click to tweet. That is what we want. You'll go ahead and you'll click it, and you will be given this nice, lovely box that looks a little weird because there's some styling issues. No idea why. You type the tweet that you want to display in Twitter in this top box. Then you choose which theme you would like to use for this CTT. You could choose the theme right here. As we mentioned, you could just leave it at the default for Living on a Prayer. I think we had it set to. And this is the quote that you want to show on the page. So it's kind of cool because it allows you to customize the content that's tweeted in addition to the content that's on the quote. So you could incorporate your @ symbol. So I would say like hello world, and then do @ScottT Hartley for my Twitter handle as the tweet prompt text, and then just for your quote, you could put hello world, and then you can modify the theme as I mentioned. It's fine. I don't use these too much, mostly because I'm terrible at managing my own social media profiles. But you come over here, you get the hello world, you click it, it'll prompt you to share it to Twitter. Very common functionality found in a lot of sharing plugins. Social identity, this is where you're going to want to incorporate all the names of your social media platforms that you have. For your Twitter username, include your @handle, so @ScottT Hartley. Your Pinterest username, I probably have a Pinterest, but I couldn't tell you what it was. Your Facebook page URL, don't put your actual profile URL here, put your page URL. And you can use the Facebook app ID if you want to get tracking for the share counter. It's also recommended for Open Graph they say it's required. Most people don't add it. It doesn't affect the sharing really, but something to keep in mind. Social network connections, you could just choose to outright connect it with your Facebook account. For your Open Graph OG variable types, you can modify what the type is of the post or the page. As far as I remember, these aren't really used all that much. You could do product as the product one, but these don't change all that much for most things. But for your post, article, for your pages, you could do article. That's totally fine. Article is kind of like the default catch-all, like how web page is the default catch-all for schema markup. It works functionally the same. The tweet count registration, so you can choose to use one of two services because Twitter stopped having their own official Twitter count service. They dropped it. A few others dropped it. LinkedIn, I believe. Maybe. Share counters just don't provide a lot of value for users, and it requires quite a bit of overhead from the social network side to keep things running. So there's a couple of options. You can use twitcount.com, which is a very large and popular third-party service, or you can use opensharecount.com, which is an alternative. Personally, I would go ahead and use twitcount.com. You go to the website, and it'll open a new prompt. You'll have to do a bunch of stuff. You'll have to give me back your followers by connecting your Twitter account. It'll keep track of it on their service. And then you just choose to enable tweet counts and to make sure that you're using the tweet count source as twitcount.com. If you want to use OpenShareCount, you can also use that. It's personal preference, really. Just keep in mind that because these are third-party services and they're not a perfect fix, if twitcount.com ever goes down or they just delete their service, you're going to lose those share counters. That's kind of just the reality of the matter. But both of these have been around for quite a while, so you'll be fine. For the advanced tab, you do get some interesting functionality in here. So as always, you get the Gutenberg blocks, which is if you're using the Gutenberg plugin for WordPress 4.9, or you're just using any of the Gutenberg plugins that you're running now, and you're just running any later version of WordPress, you turn the blocks on, it'll load the blocks in the back end. They shouldn't really ever break anything. Basically, this is a switch in here for, in the event of Gutenberg updating and breaking their plugin, they don't put out a fix, you can turn it off and you can go back and your editor should be fixed. Basically what it's for. Frame Buster, this will stop pirates from, as it mentions, from framing your content. That's fine. It's kind of a silly option. You can turn it on, but that's the default behavior. It doesn't really matter too much to me. Link shortening, you can automatically shorten all your links. You can only do this with a Bitly account. So you'll go here. Well, you can do it with Rebrandly too, but I've never used Rebrandly personally. But you use Bitly, you log into your account, you authenticate it, and what that does is it'll automatically create the short links from your Bitly accounts. It'll store it in there if you want to track your analytics, your clicks data, everything that you would expect. It works great. I've tested it before. Love its functionality. I've set it up for a couple clients. Never had any problems. The minimum publish date allows you to set obviously the minimum publish date of when this should take effect. Or if you don't want to use it at all, totally fine. You just click off. What you can also do though is you can choose to turn off for each post type. Personally, and this is just my recommendation, you should send this to pages that you want to be tracked. I would not enable it for your homepage. Doesn't really provide a lot of value. Most users are not even going to enable the share buttons on their homepage because they look kind of tacky on pages that they don't make sense for. And they don't really get a lot of engagement. Most people don't share homepages anymore. They share post products directly. Even pages are quite silly to enable these buttons on, unless you have a very interesting site structure. And if you have a really cool site structure where you're sharing buttons on pages, please comment below. Give me a link. I'd love to see it. Products are obviously a good one to have. WooCommerce is widely used, and that's going to get you some share buttons. I would recommend it for your posts and your products. I wouldn't do it for like portfolio pages or anything else where you could get one-off shares, because Bitly Free does have a limit on the number of links that you can create and monitor. So you only want to do it for the important post types. If you're an editorial website, set it for your posts. If you're a WooCommerce website and you have a lot of products, only set it for the products. It's really personal preference, but that's just my advice to you. The analytics tracking, if you want to set up UTM link tracking in Google Analytics, you're able to do so. And as I mentioned here, you do button click tracking. So you can track when somebody clicks on a share button, and then you can append a UTM link tracking from it. So you could set up the medium, what your campaign is, and you can even do it on Pinterest pins. Speaking of Pinterest, you get the advanced Pinterest settings, which they're nothing to really, you shouldn't have to mess around with these, but you get some extra flexibility. So you could choose to set the Pinterest image for browser extensions, and you could use a couple of things. Number one, for the Pinterest image location, you could choose to keep it hidden at the top of each post or at the bottom of each post. You could choose the fallback image to show a selection of all images, or to use your featured image. The easiest thing to do is just to set your featured image if you're using them. If you're unsure, if you have a really weird site structure where you're not actively using your featured image, go ahead and set show a selection of all images. That's the default behavior. You could just add a data pin description to images that do not have one. Sure. And then what you can then do is do a description source, and you could choose to use the image alt text or a custom pin description. I would just use image alt text if you're properly using your alt text. And I made a video on a plugin that automatically will take your images, scan them, and generate the alt text by identifying the content of the image. It even found a really weird one, it was like a 2013 Land Rover, and it knew what year the car was and which one it was. It's kind of cool. So if you're doing proper alt text, and I don't mean a hacky workaround like where you're using rank math SEO to auto-generate your alt tags, that's not going to work. You have to, I believe that this extracts it from the alt attribute assigned to the image. Personally, I just wouldn't worry about it too much. But if you're going to go ahead and have a description source, set it to alt image as opposed to the description. For share recovery, so what this shouldn't matter for most of you. But if you had a website at one point that was over HTTP and you changed to HTTPS, your share counts do get lost. And that's because back when a lot of share counters did exist, frankly, HTTPS wasn't that common and it certainly wasn't free. So a issue would occur when you went from HTTP certmedia.com to HTTPS. Your share counters did reset because it treated them as two separate entities. What this does is it tries to resolve that issue so that way they don't get lost. So as I mentioned here, you can also do it from a URL format. It's actually quite an intelligent tool, and this is something that a lot of people forget. So you change your site to HTTP to HTTPS, or you change your URL structure. I made a video on the permit link structure, and I typically use the post name. But let's say at one point you had the date as your time. So you choose your previous URL format as a month and name. So you had month and name selected, and then you went to your existing one. All of those share accounts could be lost because there's no way to say certmedia.com 2020 0613 hello world and reference that to being hello world. This tool will try to resolve that. Well, it says, well, this is the same URL and the share count should be pulled as if it was this URL. And it's really intelligent. It works on the same principle as the HTTP to HTTPS functionality. This is something you don't have in a lot of share plugins, is that deep of fixing, quite frankly, fixing an issue, because people do change their URL structure. And even if you 3-in-1 redirect it, that may not get you back your share counts. And if you're really particular about your share counts, this is a good fix for you. You could choose your previous connection protocol if it's been changed or it hasn't been, and you could choose your previous domain prefix, because if you had a subdomain, let's say it was news.certmedia.com, and that's where my blog lived, and I just put it on certmedia.com, well, the old subdomain no longer exists, but my share counts were attributed to that. And the same thing works for the www. www is technically a subdomain, and that can be treated as a secondary URL. So it just allows you to fix it, and it works great. And if you migrated from even one website to another, you could fill this in to restore your share counts. I don't need to do that, so we're going to close that. And then finally, you could use full content versus excerpts. If your theme for some reason doesn't use excerpts and displays full content on your homepage or category pages, this toggle will basically just turn on the buttons to show on there. Personally, I'm not that big of a fan of showing buttons on excerpts, and I'm certainly not a fan of it showing on any post page, on any URL that isn't the post itself. If you had a site though, where your blog page and that blog page was just one large entry, so it was your first post, and that first post was showing the full content, and then you had like 3 other posts at the bottom that were just excerpts, I could see a scenario where that does make sense. You could try turning on this option, but the one thing that I couldn't guarantee is whether or not this would only load for the full content post and not your excerpts. So that's something you will have to test. That's a really rare edge case. So I've only seen it on one website where they were showing full content on the homepage of their blog, and it was more of a kind of like journal style entry for an individual. So it's an obscure use case, but this can help you with that. My recommendation though is just don't show the full content of the post. Don't show the full content of the post except for on that post URL. It's going to make tracking hard. If users are not going to the post, you don't know how well it's performing. If they just go to your blog page, then you kind of have to assume that everything on your blog page is for that first post. It's a very weird setup, but I have seen it happen. But if you do have a question about Social Warfare Pro, because we've gone through the whole thing, and it is a great option. It's quick. It's much faster than using something like add this or add to any or share this. Don't use those services. Even if you need all those share buttons, you're honestly better off paying I think it's like $29 for this. You'll be much better off performance-wise. You have a lot of flexibility. You have stylish buttons that you can easily customize, and I would recommend it. I would recommend it for a lot of websites solely because if you're not a developer and you can't customize the buttons with CSS and you need the flexibility to make them fit your brand a little bit better, this is a really good option. There is a lot of flexibility in here for you. Now, if it came down to paying $29 for the year for this, or going from a $3 a month host to like a $10 a month host, I would definitely go with your hosting. It's more important. But Social Warfare, it's great. You should honestly consider upgrading if you need the extra buttons and you need that flexibility. If you're fine with a free version though, or you're considering an alternative, check out the Nova Share video. Another great plugin. These two are definitely my favorite share button plugins on the market. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask in the comments below. I'll try to help you out. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.